Welcome back to Kings of the North. Doug Lesmerises with a big picture college football topic this week that I think is going to be interesting. Have some research on this, have some opinions on this. And in the second half of the show, my good friend and former show partner, Shehan Jeyarajah of CBSSports.com, also now the host of the College Football Playoff Show, which he and I used to co-host together. He will join me to discuss the idea of whether Ohio State is natty or bust this season. And I want to talk about the concept of national title or bust in the modern college football era. I don't like it. One of the things I want to do on this show is help college football fans maximize the enjoyment of your college football team. To do that, I think we have to have smart discussions about the teams in the North. I think we have to provide context for you to understand where your team fits into the picture. I think we have to understand when your program might be up, when it might be down. And I don't like definitive all or nothing, that's it, success or failure kinds of discussions, because I think that's a great way for you to not like your team. It is a way for you to be frustrated with your team. It is a way for you to not enjoy Saturdays, to be angry at close wins, to be overly upset, especially in a 12-team playoff, at losses. So I have already this offseason pushed back against the idea of Ohio State as a national championship or bust team, because I believe in the idea that, well, what does this mean? Are we going to turn potential and opportunity and talent into a burden? Are we going to take something good and make it bad? Are we going to set a standard where there is only one possible outcome that will make anybody happy? And if Ohio State or any team in this situation falls short of that, now you're mad. Now you're sad. Now you're miserable. Now you're frustrated. Now you're not enjoying your team. I believe in the journey in sports far more than the end goal. But I might be alone. And I know that. The reason Shahan's going to join us is because I saw him tweet the other day something about national championship or bust for Ohio State after somebody talked about like all the good players they have. So when Ohio State brings back as many guys who could have gone to the NFL as they have, whether that's a Mecca Ibuka, who might have been the first-round receiver. He got hurt last year, certainly coming off the 2022 season. He looked like a first-round receiver, 1,000-yard receiver. He's back. He didn't go to the NFL. They have probably the best 1-2 punch at running back in college football with senior Travion Henderson, who's been an important part of the Ohio State offense for 4 years. 4 years now, 3 years so far. And Quinshon Judkins, a third-year player who was a great running back at Ole Miss. They have most of their offensive line back, but it's really about Ohio State's defense, as I think you guys probably know. JT Tuimoloau, Jack Sawyer, and Tyleik Williams on the defensive line all had NFL choices, and all three of them stayed. Denzel Burke at corner had that choice and stayed. I think Davison Igbinosun at the opposite corner has a breakout year coming, possibly could become a first-round pick. Jordan Hancock as the slot corner could have gone to the NFL and stayed. Lathan Ransom at safety could have gone to the NFL and stayed. They added Caleb Downs, who we talked about. PFF said he's the best safety prospect in college football. If he had been eligible for this draft, he would have been the first safety off the board. He's not eligible because he just transferred from Alabama, and this is only his second year in college football. And then at linebacker, they have 2 5-stars, Sonny Styles and CJ Hicks, who are going to work in some way, and a veteran guy in Cody Simon. They have it all. And they've been there, and they've been close. So I do think if you are going to assign the mantle of natty or bust, and Denzel Burke has already said a version of that this offseason for Ohio State, in the 2024 season, I think you would assign it to Ohio State. Now, the question is, do you want to assign it to anybody? Because is the bust for real? Or is the bust enhanced? Is the bust not really what you think it is? Does it mean that if you don't win a national title, it's a failure? So that's national title as the goal. Great. The bust part of it is where I differ from a lot of people. So Shahan and I, in the second half of the show, are going to set out like what I have 4 questions for him and why he maybe thinks Ohio State fits this parameter. First half of the show, we're going to lay out a little bit of history. And the more I researched the history, the more I was like, oh, no, I think Ohio State's probably a national title. Natty or bust. Yeah, oh, no, actually, they fit almost every parameter that you would find. I've laid out 4 things that must occur for any team to be national championship or bust. And then I think you can look at talent, and in particular, last year talent, the last go round for guys. Because if you're not losing guys, like, well, if they don't, then it's not bust. It's Natty or Natty next year. Natty or Natty next year is not a t-shirt slogan. So it's got to be players you know to be great who are in their last years. And certainly Ohio State has a lot of those. So I have laid out since the BCS era began in 1998. And part of Natty or bust is you've got to define what the Natty is. So before the BCS era, when it was like, well, it's the Bowl Coalition or it's a bunch of drunk AP voters deciding on New Year's Day who should be how can you be bust in that situation when you don't even know what the Natty is? So it's a modern invention. So I don't think anybody in college football could be Natty or bust before 1998. Because you might have been like, well, if you're in the Big Ten or the Pac-10, now Pac-12, now Pac-nothing, you were Rose Bowl or bust, and I hope we get some votes for the Natty. Like, that's nothing. So when you get to the BCS, you get to a situation where you can reach a national title game and you can control your own destiny. If you're a good team and you win all of your regular season games, you almost certainly will get a chance to play and win a national title on the field. So I went since 1998, I defined 11 teams that I believe were Natty or bust. If you believe in that, which maybe I don't, going into that season. Of those 11, 4 won the national title. 3 lost in the national title game, and 4 got sideways during the regular season. So we will go over that. We will go over my parameters for what makes a Natty or bust season. And maybe you disagree. If as we go here on YouTube, if you agree with the point, give me a thumb. If you disagree, say, Doug, you idiot. This is why you're wrong. And maybe we can continue that discussion on YouTube. But I want to start with a parameter that I think will apply to this Ohio State team a year from now. And it is, how many NFL draft picks do you have in a single year? And in the history of the NFL draft, there have been 6 teams, 6 college teams that had at least 12 players drafted in a single year. Every single one of those 6 won a national title with that group of players. They did not bust. So by this standard, which is a retroactive standard, but I think we can apply it ahead to Ohio State and anticipate that this is where Ohio State will be in the 2025 NFL draft. When you think about probably 8 or 9 guys who could be drafted off the Ohio State offense. 8 or 9 guys who would be drafted off the Ohio State defense. And then you think about Emeka Egbuka. You think about Donovan Jackson on the offensive line. You think about Quinshon Judkins and Travion Henderson in the backfield. You think about maybe Will Howard at quarterback. I do think Ohio State will reach this threshold of 12 NFL draft picks. So let's talk about what has happened so far. The most single draft picks in one year for a college team is Georgia, had 15 picks in 2022, right after winning the 2021 national championship. Now, they came back and then won another national championship after losing all this talent, which is something to admire, but cashed it in. Okay, we think this, and I don't even think Georgia was Natty or bust in 2021 because of where the program was at that time, because Kirby Smart had not done it, because Kirby Smart was entering year 6 as a college football coach, and Georgia as a program had not won a national title since 1980. I don't think, and we'll get to the definitions in a second, I don't think Georgia was natty or bust, but man, it turns out they cashed in their talent because the NFL draft is nice. It's not the end game. It might be the end game for a player. It's not the end game for any program. If the walls of your college football headquarters feature more NFL draft picks than feature championships and big wins and trophies for what happened in college, it's not the point. It's how you get to the point. You win trophies because you have a bunch of NFL guys. So Georgia, 15 picks in 2022. They cashed it in 2021. 14 picks, 2004 Ohio State. They cashed that in 2 years previous. So then they came back in 2003, still had a very good team with a lot of the guys who keyed the 2002 undefeated 14-0 Ohio State national championship team. They did not do it. They lost in 2003. They were good. They weren't a national championship team. But I would say they cashed it in previously. So when you saw all these draft picks for Ohio State in 2004, you didn't say, "Oh, yeah, what was wrong with those guys?" Well, that's who helped them win 2 years previous. So Ohio State cashed that in. This is maximizing cash it in. LSU in 2020, 14 draft picks off the 2019 national championship team. Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson and Clyde Edwards-Helaire and Grant Delpit and a bunch of those defensive guys, right? Like absolutely cashed it in. One of the great seasons for any team in college football history. I think arguably the greatest individual season in college football history with what Joe Burrow did as a Heisman winner, national champion, #1 draft pick. LSU cashed it in. Last year, 13 draft picks for the Michigan Wolverines in 2024 off the 2023 national title. Were they natty or bust? Exactly. We'll have to see if they made my list or not, but we saw the talent. I argued it from the jump with Michigan as soon as this show started. If you thought this was a discussion about Michigan just being experienced, that was wrong. They were experienced. They were also talented. 13 draft picks after they cashed it in. 12 draft picks for Alabama in 2018 off the 2017 national title. Directly cashed it in. 12 draft picks for Ohio State in 2016. That's the 2014 national title. So again, both the Ohio State teams here, it was a delay that they won, and then it was 2 drafts later where they cashed that in. But this is the 2014 national championship was spurred by that sophomore class at Ohio State. You guys know that. Ezekiel Elliott, Joey Bosa, Darren Lee, Eli Apple, all the guys like that who then got drafted a couple years later. So 12 draft picks. So the point is here, by this standard, if you believe Ohio State will have at least 12 draft picks a year from now, which I believe, then they must win the national title. This would back up natty or bust because everybody else with this much NFL talent in an individual group got there. Now, there were some, right? And then there's a bunch of teams at 11, some of whom got there, some of whom didn't, some of whom were very close. The 2 teams that have the most first round picks in a draft, it's Alabama in 2021 and Miami in 2004. Alabama 2021, 6 first round picks. They were coming off the 2020 national title. So that was directly cashing it in. And then Miami in 2004, they won the 01 title. And then they lost in the 02 national championship game, and then they did not do it in 03. So a little bit of a delay, but actually, like Miami probably did not quite cash it in. But anyway, the bottom line is 6 for 6, the 6 best single drafts, 6 national titles. All right, that is in favor of the idea that Ohio State is natty or bust. Let's lay out the definition of that then. I have 4 things that I think must be in place for any program to qualify for a natty or bust designation. Number 1 is that you have not won a previous national title with this group of players, which means if you're trying to repeat, you can't be natty or bust because you've already nattied. And it's so hard to repeat. And I think you could argue that once the Bama dynasty got going, there was no single year that Alabama was natty or bust. Because it's like, well, what if Alabama doesn't win the national title this year? They have so many good players. Even if they're losing them all, They got another bunch of guys stacked up. Like there's no bust about it. So if you're in the midst of a dynasty and if you're in the midst of a dominant decade, I would argue that no single year can be natty or bust. Does Ohio State fit this parameter? Yeah, absolutely. So these are all these players who came back. It is this very highly rated 2021 Ohio State recruiting class that only lost Marvin Harrison Jr. and Mike Hall Jr. to this NFL draft. And then everybody else that we just talked about, Denzel Burke and JT Tuimoloau and Jack Sawyer and Emeka Ibuka and Travion Henderson and Donovan Jackson, all these guys who could have gone pro after their junior year came back for their senior year. Why are they back? This is part of it too. Sometimes like, well, why are you in a natty or bust situation? Because you have no natty. They wouldn't all be back if they had a natty. So that's absolutely part of it. And so like Ohio State, after winning the 2014 national title, it was disappointing for all those players to be back because they couldn't go pro yet, and for Ohio State to not win the national title in 2015. But I would not have designated Ohio State as natty or bust because, well, they're trying to repeat, and it's just a different thing. It's a different energy when you've already achieved something. So number one is no title with this group of players. That's what you have to have if you're going to be natty or bust. What is the second thing that makes you natty or bust? I think you almost have to be a blue blood. Your program has to have national title standards. As experienced as Washington was last year, I don't think anybody could have said that Washington is natty or bust in 2023. And I don't think anybody did. Oh, you might expect them to have a great year, but the bust implies an expectation that I think only accompanies 8 to 10 programs in college football. And I think you would know who they are. I don't know that Texas yet. That Texas has been down for so long. Is Texas back? Well, they made the playoff last year. They're looking in the preseason like one of the 4 best teams this year. Could you say Texas is natty or bust this year because Quinn Ewers stayed in school because they have a good offensive line? I don't know. I probably wouldn't. I just don't know. Like they're still trying to recover. I don't know that Texas is good enough right now to be natty or bust. And then I do think sometimes if you're just like even if you have good talent, if historically that's not what your fan base expects, where a national title discussion is normal, then I don't think you're there. That would apply to like Washington. So I think there's probably only 8 to 10 programs where you could even have this discussion. Is Ohio State one of them? Yeah, absolutely. Ohio State's one of them. So national title standard without a national title for these players, checking 2 boxes for Ohio State so far. What is number 3 on our list of what is required? I think you would have to know you're losing great players after this season, which is what we talked about. And there's a lot of this. This was a big one in trying to make, as I went through and tried to pick out the natty or bust teams, a lot of it is, hey, we had a lot of returning starters. Hey, we had All-Americans who were back. You might have a Heisman winner who's back. Now, Ohio State doesn't have that, but they have a lot of high-level players. Now, actually, like in terms of individual honors and that kind of thing, as good as a lot of these Ohio State guys have been, they haven't won that. Marvin Harrison Jr. was their best player. He's not back. So if he's back, then it's even a higher level of potentially natty or bust. But in general, these Ohio State players stayed with and for a purpose. And I still think Ohio State season is closer to beat Michigan or bust and position yourselves to win the natty. I think I would be potentially 100% in on Ohio State being beat Michigan or bust in 2024. I don't know that I'll get to 100% on natty or bust for Ohio State, but certainly the idea of there are guys in their final seasons. This Ohio State team will look very different in 2025 than it will in 2024. They have 9 starters back on their defense. They might have 3 starters back on their defense in 2025. And I think they have 5 starters back on their offense. They might have 4 or 5 starters back on their offense next year. So a lot's changing. So that's number 3. Ohio State also checks this box for sure. And number 4 on the list of what qualifies here to be natty or bust, I think you can only have one natty or bust team each season, because then otherwise you're guaranteeing a bust. If it's like, well, we're Natty or bust. No, we're Natty or bust. It has to be your year. I think the general perception in the sport has to be like, it's their year. And I think Ohio State fits this. I do think Ohio State and Georgia, in some order, will be the top two teams in preseason rankings. I do think Texas and Oregon will be 3 and 4. I don't know that Texas or Oregon rises to the level of a national championship standard that would let them be Natty or bust. And Georgia has won too much. There are too many guys on this roster. Even if they weren't the stars, they're only 2 years. They're national title, didn't win a national title. They can't be Natty or bust now this year. The titles are too recent. They have too many guys who were part of it. Malachi Starks was a huge part of a national title already. Michael Williams on that Georgia defense, already a huge part of a national title, right? Carson Beck was the backup quarterback, but he was around. So I don't think Georgia can be Natty or bust. I don't think Texas can be. I don't think Oregon can be. Alabama with Saban gone certainly is not. And Michigan just won last year. So no matter what they have, they can't be Natty or bust. Because if you're trying to repeat, you can't be that. So I think Ohio State probably stands alone as the Natty or bust candidate of 2024. So those are the 4 things I think have to be in place for you to potentially be Natty or bust. And Ohio State's 4 for 4. Okay. Let's compare them to history. I decided on 11 programs since 1998 that entered a season Natty or bust. And guess what? A couple of them are Ohio State teams. So this is, I get like the idea of this show is like, hey, Shahan thinks Ohio State's Natty or bust. He's crazy. Let's have him on. I'm going to disagree with him. And by the time we get to Shahan, I might be in agreement with him. Let's start the list. The first team that I believe was Natty or bust in the BCS era was in the first year of the BCS in 1998, and it was Ohio State. Ohio State was coming off the disappointment of 1996 when they felt like they were probably the best team in the country and they did not get it done. They are number 1 in the preseason in 1998. They are going to have guys like David Boston and Joe Germain on offense and Andy Katzenmoyer and Antoine Winfield on defense, who will go on to the NFL draft in 1999. They are going to have it's 8 overall draft picks. And again, they're the preseason number 1 in 1998. So I think it's fair to say, given the talent level and the disappointments of the John Cooper era, that Ohio State was Natty or bust in 1998, and they lost to Michigan State in a year when they went on to beat Michigan. So it's one of the great upsets in Ohio State history. They lose to Nick Saban and Michigan State. It knocks them off track. They would have made a 4-team playoff. They certainly would have made a 12-team playoff. They wind up 11-1 and ranked number 2, but they bust. They do not win the national championship. Second team on my list, the next year, 1999, Florida State. Florida State is coming off a national title loss to Tennessee the year before. Peter Warrick, who is maybe the best receiver, probably the best receiver in college football, may have been the number 1 pick in the NFL draft, sort of surprisingly stays in college. Chris Wenke, their quarterback, is back. That is a great foundation to build on. And as much of a legend as Bobby Bowden was, they'd only won one national title under Bobby Bowden so far. And it's kind of like, okay, well, they've got everything back. They're the overwhelming number 1 team. And guess what? They win the national title. So I think it's fair to say 1999 Florida State is Natty or bust, and they get the Natty. 2001 Miami is the next team on my list. They had just missed the BCS title game in 2000. They actually had a pretty good case to make it, and they did not. So they're motivated by that. Butch Davis leaves for the NFL. Larry Coker is in year 1 as a head coach, which might make you say, like, I don't know. Are they're really going to be Natty or bust here? But they are going to have 4 first-round picks in the next draft in 2002. So the last year in 2001, including Santana Moss and Reggie Wayne at receiver. And this is like the U had been established by then, but they hadn't won a national title in 10 years. So they won it in 83, 87, 89, and 91. They're now going into 01. There's a 10-year gap. They have all this talent. And they're like, man, we should have made the national title game last year, and we didn't. I think it's Natty or bust for Miami in 2001. and they win the Natty. And then they come back in 2002, which can't be Natty or bust for them because they're the defending national champs and they lose to Ohio State. So I think they qualify as Natty or bust with what they had back, and they did get there. Next up, 2004 Oklahoma. Oklahoma is a very interesting discussion in here because Bob Stoops got a title at Oklahoma in year 2 that it was a bit of a surprise. They were number 19 in the preseason rankings in 2000, and they went on to win the national title. So the year they won the national title, they weren't even close to Natty or bust. But then in 2001, 2002, 2003, they finished 6th, 5th, and 3rd. They bring back Jason White, the Heisman Trophy winner, in 2004. They have a freshman running back named Adrian Peterson, who is unlike anything anybody has seen in a freshman running back. He looked ready for the NFL. He ran for 1,900 yards. They knew how good he was going to be. So you have a veteran Heisman winning quarterback. You have a freshman monster running back. And they had been very close and lost the national title game in 2003. So they're loaded for bear. I think Oklahoma. This was a different, Jason White was like a young backup on the 2000 national title team, but it's a different group of players from 2000. It's far enough away that it's a different group of players, and they bust. They make the national title game, but they lose to USC. They kind of get boat raced by USC in the national title game. So they fall short. They bust 2004 Oklahoma. 5th in this era is 2006 Ohio State. We're back to Ohio State again. Ohio State actually lost a ton of talent off the 2005 team that was really good, but lost to Texas and Penn State. You'll notice I don't have either team here for the 2005 season that people called the national title game between USC and Texas the game of the century, because USC in 2005 was coming off a national title, so they can't be Natty or bust. And Texas, I just think, is a step short there. They were 1-2 in the preseason. You know, Vince Young was going to be great, but I didn't quite get there on Texas as Natty or bust. So now we're skipping to 2006. Ohio State's back. You know Troy Smith has got it. You know Ted Ginn Jr. is awesome. They did lose A.J. Hawk and Dante Whitner and Bobby Carpenter and a bunch of guys off that defense, but they still had a lot of defensive talent. They're number 1 in the preseason. They're an overwhelming number 1 in the preseason. And they beat number 2 Texas in the second week of the year, and it's sort of off to the races, and it's like, okay, like this is... and again, it's far enough removed from the 2002 national title that there were guys who were super young freshmen there, but not contributors. I think Ohio State in 2006 as Natty or bust is fair. If you want to argue against it, I think you could, but I think it's reasonable. And when you think about what Troy Smith did that year and won the Heisman and how good Ted Ginn Jr. was, and Anthony Gonzalez went on to be a first-round pick, and then James Laurinaitis and Malcolm Jenkins and guys like that were young stars on that defense in 2006 that went on to be high NFL picks. I think 2006 Ohio State fits the bill. And they busted. Lost the national title game 41-14 to Florida. 2007 USC. They would have 10 players picked in the 2008 draft off this team. 7 of them in the first 2 rounds. Mark Sanchez, their quarterback, did come back in 2008. So like if you want to say that like they weren't Natty or bust because Sanchez was coming back, I maybe would buy it, but this was like a really good team. And again, it's like sort of a reset, a new group of players. It's not the Matt Leinart, Reggie Bush guys. So even though they won a national title in 2004, and even though they played the game of the century and lost in the title game in 2005, I think 2007 is enough removed from that with the Mark Sanchez group of Trojans that I think it's fair to call them national title or bust. A lot of expectations, and they have this huge Stanford upset as like a 40-point favorite. They lose to Jim Harbaugh in Stanford in the middle of the year. They don't recover from that. They wind up 11-2, and they wind up busting. Next team, national title or bust. This is maybe a little iffy with where the Georgia program was in 2008, but they'd been pretty good. And they were number 1 in both preseason polls in 2008 for the first time ever. So this was like the best of Georgia that had not won a national title since 1980. And they did have Matthew Stafford as in his last year at quarterback. He would go on to be the number 1 pick in the next NFL draft. So you knew this was it with Stafford. You knew he had that ability. They're number 1 in both polls, and they lose to Bama in September. So it's possible that the Georgia program did not meet the national title standard in 2008 that I set out as a requirement. So maybe a little iffy here, but I think this was still like, this was the best Georgia team in 25 years. And it's like, well, Georgia should have great players. So I'm okay with this. And they busted. They finished 10-3. Did not get there. 2009, Texas. They had only lost one game the year before in 2008. They lost on like the crazy last second Michael Crabtree catch for Texas Tech. So like they were right there in 08. They wound up beating Ohio State in the Fiesta Bowl in 08. They come back in 09. Colt McCoy, starting quarterback in 6, 7, and 8, comes back as a fourth-year starter in 2009. So it's like, okay, they're loaded up for this, and they make the national title game, right? Colt McCoy gets hurt, and they lose to Bama, and they finish 12-1. I think the standard of what Texas has been, I think it's far enough removed from the Vince Young version of Texas in 05. It's this new group. It's the Colt McCoy version of Texas. I think Texas is enough of a blue blood at that time to call Texas natty or bust in 2009. We're back to USC in 2012. This is Lane Kiffin, USC. They had been ineligible for the national title the year before because of some sanctions. Third year for Lane Kiffin, 18 starters back, including Matt Barkley as a fourth-year starting quarterback who stayed for unfinished business. Okay, that's like, again, hey, we're all back chasing something. And they went 7-6. This is the bustiest bust that ever busted. So, and then Lane Kiffin got fired the next year. So this was like post Pete Carroll USC. They've still got it. And then it was, oh no, they don't got it. And they busted. But going into that year, 18 starters back off an excellent team. They were natty or bust, and they didn't come close. Now, so that's 2012. So that's from 1998 to 2012. I have 9 teams, I believe. In the last decade, now, there's only been 2 in my mind, because you get into this Alabama dynasty that's like, well, Bama, it's like, how can anybody, Bama can't be natty or bust because they have so many natties. And part of it is, how can anyone be bust against Bama? That it's like, oh, if you don't win the national title, you're a failure. It's like, they're standing right there. Nick Saban is right there. So if we don't beat Nick Saban, if we don't defeat the greatest college football coach of all time, we're a failure. We busted. That's why there's this big gap in natty or bust, because Nick Saban's blocking everything and dominating. But in 2016, I think Clemson met this threshold. Deshaun Watson is back. Clemson loses the national title game. Great close national title game to Alabama in 2015. Deshaun Watson's back. It's like, okay, it's now or never. And this is the rise of Clemson. So Clemson, were they a national title standard with the program? Maybe not, but they were national title talent. And historically, no, but in the moment, yes. Bama and Clemson are the 2 best teams in the sport. Deshaun Watson's back. You got to take your shot. It's now or never. And they do it. They do lose a regular season game, but they get back to the national title game and they get over the top. They beat Alabama for the national title. So Clemson, I believe, was natty or bust in 2016, and they won the national championship. And then we jumped 7 years to Michigan last year. I would not have been here with Michigan before the season. But I think, looking back, if you're going to apply natty or bust anywhere, I think it's probably right. Because of what we said with the NFL draft picks, they had so many NFL guys. Knowing that Jim Harbaugh was open to the NFL, if not now, when? For Michigan. Now, maybe you say, listen, man, Bo Schembechler never won a national championship at Michigan. They hadn't won a national championship since 1997. Like, what are we doing here? Like, is Michigan at that national title standard? But when you think about the fact that they had made the playoff the previous 2 seasons, they were coming off a semifinal loss to TCU that they thought they blew it. They returned so many guys. They worked NIL to bring back Blake Corum and bring back that offensive line. And they had a starting quarterback returning in J.J. McCarthy. I do think Michigan's enough of a blue blood. Obviously, Michigan is a blue blood, but they had had enough recent success that maybe in the moment, I would not have wanted to put that on Michigan, but other people did, and Jim Harbaugh didn't shy away from it. Jim Harbaugh understood the expectations and sort of laid it out there in the preseason, and guess what? They did it. So I do think this is a difference between Michigan and Washington. You couldn't do this to Washington, but I think you could do it to Michigan. So that kind of ramps it up for Ohio State. In 2024, it's like, oh, your rival was in this spot last year, and guess what they did? They won 15-0, including beating you. So, excuse me. That brings us to Ohio State in 2024. They went 4 for 4 on my checklist of what you must be to be Natty or bust. And when you look historically, if you are going to apply this to as many teams as I applied it to, 11 teams dating back to 1998, Ohio State is probably a stronger Natty or bust candidate than at least 7 or 8 of those teams that I applied it to. So I think it's probably fair to say that Ohio State is one of the 5 biggest Natty or bust teams of the modern era of college football since the BCS started in 1998. That doesn't mean I'm going to apply it to Ohio State. That doesn't mean we're going to come on at the end of the season and say that Ohio State's a failure if they didn't win the national championship. Clearly, they have everything they need. Clearly, they are the team for this year for it to be applied to. But I don't know. It might be theoretical. I just maybe don't like this label. That might be what it is. But I also wonder how this label does or doesn't change in a 12-team playoff, where all of a sudden, okay, you're increasing your chances of getting there, but you're also requiring that you're probably going to play 3 pretty awesome teams to win the national championship, as opposed to go undefeated, get in, win 1 game, go undefeated, get in, win 2 games. Now you've got to go undefeated, get in, win 3 games. And depending, right, if you're in a good conference and Oregon jumps up and gets Ohio State or they lose, they might have to play 4 games if they're not the Big Ten champ. So Shehan is going to help us work this out, but I have already worked myself a good chunk of the way toward Shehan's opinion about Ohio State being Natty or bust just through this exercise. So I think Ohio State is a good lens for this. I think it's a Northern discussion that could be applied in future years in the North to Oregon. As Oregon rises up the ranks, I think it could be applied once again to Michigan. I don't know if a program like Penn State would ever get, certainly not right now. Penn State would, I think, have to make the playoff and win some playoff games for a couple years before they would ever get into a Natty or bust conversation. I do think Penn State in the next 2 years could be in a playoff or bust conversation for sure. But I don't know how many teams could get to Natty or bust, but might be staring the Buckeyes right in the face. All right, when we come back, Shehan Jeyarajah will join us here on Kings of the North. Is Ohio State Natty or bust? Joined now by my old friend, Shehan Jeyarajah. We did a show together called the College Football Playoff Show where we were co-hosts. I bailed, and now the show is like a rocket ship through the roof to the moon. Shehan, thanks for joining us here for the first time on Kings of the North. You and I have done so many shows together, but just so people know, you're smart, you're affable, you're a new papa. You are a national college football writer for CBSSports.com, and you're the co-host of the College Football Playoff Show. And you agreed to get into an association with me a couple years ago, which means you're also a maniac.
Well, I think you're trying to get us sued again. It's the Survivor Show now. Remember, we got our cease and desist. But no, we of course did so many episodes over the years, and it's. I'll tell you what. There's a little more production value on the front end with this show than certainly we ever got when I was waking up at 8 a.m. to record over Zoom.
It was like, did we comb our hair today? Maybe not. So that's how we did it. Yes, on the College Football Survivor Show. So people who want to listen to that, how many days a week are you guys going there on the College Football Survivor Show?
Yeah, we're going twice a week, both free shows. It's typically coming out Tuesdays and Thursdays in the morning. But, you know, it's the off season. Sometimes we fudge around with that a little bit. Yeah.
Well, I could not recommend it higher. And we're eager to have you on to discuss this Natty or bust conversation, because I kind of like to keep my eyes peeled for things I maybe can argue with you about. And I saw you tweet in response to something about Ohio State recently, I think you retweeted it and said, Natty or bust. And it's not the first time that's come up with Ohio State. So I was like, aha, let's talk about that. So I have 4 things. And I think and I just talked about this before you came on. Like, there's how it applies to Ohio State. And then there's also like the general natty or bust conversation in college football. But what makes, like, generally, and then we can see if Ohio State fits it in your mind, what makes a program natty or bust? And why do you believe it applies to Ohio State this season, assuming you believe that?
I do. And I think that natty or bust is a confluence of events. It's a combination of what you have coming back. It's a combination of what you might lose after this upcoming year. It's a conversation about what an individual coach needs to accomplish. And I think that more than anything else, it's about a program that has done everything except that, right? Like, I wouldn't say Iowa is natty or bust, right? I wouldn't say that Ole Miss is natty or bust. I think that it has to be a situation where you have a program that has checked almost every single box along the way, but hasn't gotten to that top group. And just to speak specifically about Ohio State, this is a unprecedented level of returning production, especially on the defensive side of the ball. You talk about adding what they added over the offseason via the transfer portal, and a lot of these players will not be back in 2025. I would actually, to go back to, I think that 2023 Michigan was a natty or bust type of team because of what they were poised to lose after the season, not even including their head coach, of course. So I think it has to be a mix of factors that go into it, and ultimately Ohio State passes that test for me.
I did my list of the 11 teams that I believe since the BCS era began in 1998 have been natty or bust. And I did include Michigan last year. I said, I don't know that before last season I would have said that about Michigan, but certainly in hindsight, it really hits. And I think you could have said it, and Harbaugh even dabbled with it. There are certainly comparisons between 2023 Michigan and 2024 Ohio State, right?
Oh, absolutely. And I think the other piece is you see Michigan in so many cases last year try to protect their individual season, right? They were like, we want to try to push the NCAA investigation as long as we can. We want to try to have our coach on the sideline as long as we can. We will do whatever it takes to make this season count. Like, look, what if after the season they had a giant NCAA issue and they lost games or lost players or whatever? I think they would have been comfortable with that to protect what that 2023 season was.
But we don't toss this, or this is not willy-nilly. We don't throw around natty or bust, right? Is that fair to say that it does require a specificity, or confluence was a good word by you? Right? I mean, you can't just be like, oh yeah, natty or bust, right? It's hard to check all the boxes.
Well, and I'll tell you what, too, you talk about winning a national championship in college football. It's kind of an insane thing to happen ever. Like, to actually win a national championship is very rare, much less to be expected to win a national championship. And the other piece of this too, I mean, look back, like you said, you went through the beginning of the BCS era, but in the college football playoff era, the vast majority of the teams that have won national championships, I would argue, were not natty or bust type teams. Nick Saban never really had to have a natty or bust type team. You talk about the Clemson teams in the 2010s, like, certainly would have been good for them to win one, but I don't think that they were ever truly natty or bust. But I think that, again, you mix all those factors together, and when it comes up, I mean, again, it's a high bar, in my opinion, to reach that. I'm curious to see your list of the 11. I probably wouldn't even have 11 dating back to 1998.
The only two in the playoff era to me were Michigan last year, and I did include 2016 Clemson with Deshaun Watson back, coming off the national title loss to Bama.
Sure.
But not a lot. So then this is my main thrust of the conversation. And over the course of my research, I have moved toward Ohio State is natty or bust, when I kind of was adamant for a long time that, like, let's not do that. Because to me, is natty or bust good or bad? And part of this for me is, let's not make anybody natty or bust. because what it means to me a little bit is like, you have the talent to do something great. So then why do we have to put on the punishment part of the equation? You have the talent to do something great. And if you don't, you bust. And we're going to remind you of it and rip you for it. So when you hear that phrase, is it a compliment to a team to be natty or bust? Or is it like, ho, 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 you better get it done? Is it a warning?
No, it is absolutely a negative on a team. Like, I mean, negative is a strong word. I don't know if negative is quite the right word, but it is something to be bared. It is not a compliment. It is not something that is attractive. Again, like we mentioned, you wouldn't really consider Nick Saban teams to have to deal with natty or bust expectations because there's an understanding that there's a bigger picture here in many ways. I think that when you get into a natty or bust conversation, it typically means that I don't want to go as far as saying that you've underwhelmed or not achieved to the level that you think, but in some ways that is the case. Like you are natty or bust when you're in a situation where people are wondering why you haven't yet won a natty. And for so long, of course, we've talked about Ohio State. And 2014, they finally get it done. 2002, they get of course, that title. But it had been 30 years before that. I think that Ohio State, in many ways, was a program that people wondered why they didn't have more titles, especially in a post-integration era. So I do think that ultimately it's something that hangs around your neck. It's more of an anchor than it is a compliment. Though, of course, it is I do think the one piece of it that is a compliment is you have to be a certain level of program to reach that kind of expectation. Again, we aren't going to ask Wisconsin to be natty or bust because we don't necessarily think that they're a program that quote unquote should or have the expectations of winning a national championship. For a select few programs, I do think that those are there.
So that's what I don't like. And I don't disagree with you. But especially for a fan base, to take a situation where Ohio State has 7-8 guys who could have gone to the NFL and stay. They add Caleb Downs, maybe the most impactful transfer in the portal. They get a new quarterback. They have freshman Jeremiah Smith at receiver, who may be the best freshman receiver in Ohio State history. You have all these things, and the accumulation of all these good things is, oh, you better win or you're a bunch of losers. Like, that's what I don't like. I don't want Ohio State fans, and I would apply this to any group of fans. I don't want you to tiptoe through the season. I don't want you to look at this collection of talent and be worried. But is that just the reality? Is there no way to escape it? I would like Ohio State fans and even the Ohio State program. I want the players to enjoy themselves. I would like people to enjoy this season of opportunity and possibility, which is why I might be trying to vanquish this phrase.
Well, I think that, it's the old phrase that players repeatedly say, which is pressure is a privilege, right? Like, it is a privilege to have this kind of expectation. You only can have this at the elite of the elite programs. And Ohio State, I've made the case before, I think it is the number one job in all of college football. I wouldn't make this expectation of even James Franklin at Penn State. I wouldn't make this expectation at most other programs in college football, but Ohio State has a unique place. And like you said, I mean, it adds pressure in a lot of ways to have all these unexpected guys come back, to add Caleb Downs, to add Quinshon Judkins, to add Will Howard, to add Jeremiah Smith. But the other piece of this too, would Ohio State be natty or bust if they didn't do those things? No. I do think that pressure would still be there, though. I mean, they've lost to Michigan 3 times in a row. They haven't won a Big Ten title since 2020, which was during a pandemic season. That was Ryan Day's only college football playoff win, also was during the pandemic season. And so I think that there would be a lot of pressure there regardless, just because of the level that Ohio State's gotten to without sort of hitting the next level. And so I think that this is a repeated thing. Not every program is going to have a natty or bust conversation, but I'll give you an example too, right? Lincoln Riley at Oklahoma. I have obviously covered him a lot. There became a point where making the playoff was not impressive anymore, where you make it 3 years in a row and you don't really compete in the last 2. I think that if he stuck around at Oklahoma, I don't know that he would have gotten to natty or bust for a little while, but there becomes a point where just good isn't good enough anymore. You have to continue to move up.
You're Ryan Day. You're the head coach of the Ohio State Buckeyes. Do you embrace this idea or do you vanquish and ignore this idea?
I think you have to try to vanquish and ignore this idea, at least externally, because otherwise, one, it basically sets the expectation that we can publicly admit failure, essentially say like, we didn't do the one thing that we were told that we were supposed to do. And I don't think that that's a good thing to do if you're Ryan Day. I don't think it's a good thing to embrace some of those expectations on your program and of your players, many of whom are, some of whom are brand new. And I think the other piece of it too is I think that one of the most dangerous things in college football, because this is a sport where you're dealing with 18 to 22-year-olds, where you have a lot of people, especially with the transfer portal, who are brand new, and you have to teach them how to do the right thing the right way. You need to be deep in the day-to-day. Like, you need to be involved in the day-to-day. You can't be looking at the giant goal at the end. You can't be telling your players it's about this goal that's at the end. You have to say, coaches say it all the time, but there's a lot of truth to it. We need to be focused on just week 1. That's the only game that matters right now. We can't be worried about beating our week 3 opponent or our week 7 opponent. Like, we have to be laser focused on week 1. So now, again, different coaches have different approaches from that perspective. And one piece as well, Michigan was very open about the fact that, yes, it's 1 week at a time, but also, by the way, we have an Ohio State practice period because we need to beat Ohio State. That's a big part of our identity and the way that we look at ourselves. But I think that big picture, when you have a program with such expectations, and I think this is true of Alabama under Nick Saban, I think this is true of Kirby Smart at Georgia, you have to be caught up in the details. You can't get lost in the long-term picture.
Okay. Defining this phrase again. Can there only be one natty or bust team each season? Because otherwise, if there's more than one, then somebody's guaranteed to bust. Like, is there a team? If there is a team each year, is there only one that the whole country says, oh, like, it's their time?
Well, I think that it's possible to have more than one. And like you said, most natty or bust teams are probably going to bust in general. Like, it is just really hard to actually come into a season and say, we have to win the national championship and then go and win the national championship. That's a really difficult thing to do. So I think it's possible, but again, it's a confluence of events type thing. I think that you need multiple programs to have reached a certain level, to have multiple programs with coaches that need to kind of quote unquote get over that hump. I think that, for example, let's say that for whatever reason, Michigan did not win the title last year and they brought back some of the guys like JJ McCarthy and Jim Harbaugh. I think that both Ohio State and Michigan heading into this year could be in natty or bust situations. Now, again, like, it's rare to actually get that in practice. I would say that the vast majority of times there's a natty or bust team, it's just one. But I do think it's physically possible, especially when you start saying like, well, maybe there's one in the Big Ten, but maybe there's one in the SEC as well. Maybe there's one, if you're I don't think that it would have risen to the level of certainly of being natty or bust last year, but like Florida State was pretty dang close, because they were going to lose so much off of that team. And I think that made them getting left out after an undefeated season hurt even worse, because they knew that this was their year and it might be a year or two before we get back to that point.
So when we think about the teams like in contention this year, so Georgia, to your Bama point, they can't be natty or bust because they've won 2 and people think like there's no single year for Georgia. It's like, well, if not this year, then next year or the next year or the next year. Both Michigan and Bama are in transition after losing head coaches. And in this season, I don't think either of those fan bases or programs would be like, we got to do it. And then I think Oregon and Texas are both still enough on the way up that you wouldn't say, like now or never for either of those programs. And then everybody else, right, from Utah to Penn State to LSU to USC, maybe even if you believe you could have multiple natty or bust teams in a season, it kind of feels like Ohio State is in a unique situation for this season.
There's no question. And I think you just talk about the level of investment it took to keep this roster together and add the way that they did. I mean, there's nobody else who, I don't want to say sold out for an individual season, but in some ways did, right? Like they said, we're going to stunt the development of the 2025 season by bringing back like 7 guys who maybe shouldn't be here, right? So I think that it's that combination of things. I will say, I don't think it's this year, to be clear. I think that Oregon is a year or two away from being in a natty or bust situation. I don't think they're there yet, but you kind of start looking at Dan Lanning in Oregon, and it's like they've been really close, but I think we're going to start getting to the point where we're like, all right, when are you going to get over that hump? When are you going to, you didn't beat Washington the year before, right? It's like, I think we're going to start getting closer, but we are, again, not there yet.
The last question I want to ask is what all of this means in a 12-team playoff world, because one of my favorite shows that you and I did on the Survivor show was anticipating a Cinderella in the college football playoff, in a world where we think a 12 can and will beat a 5 at some point, because we looked at the group of 5 teams that have been in the bowl games in the 10 years of the playoff. And there were some good group of 5 teams. And then when you're talking about a 5 seed who is not a conference champ, there's maybe a bit of a vulnerability there. Like I don't know that I thought that going in. You've always been much more open-minded than I am to underdogs and group of 5 teams in college football, but we definitively decided we think that's coming, right? Do you still think that that's on the horizon?
Definitely,
a 12 is going to win a game?
Definitely.
Okay. So then what does this mean in a world where previously, if you're natty or bust, well, first of all, if you were natty or bust in the 40s or 50s or 60s or 70s, you were just relying on some drunk guys to hopefully vote you in. And now once you get
bring it back.
Bring it back. We
can be those drunk guys.
The Buckeyes deserve all that. Then you get to the BCS where you've got to go undefeated, basically, or cross your fingers to lose one game and get into a one-game national championship as one of 2 teams. Now, maybe the last 10 years, you could be one of 4 teams. But the opportunity is going to expand with 12 teams. But you're also probably going to have to beat 3 pretty darn good teams to get there, as opposed to beating 1 darn good team or 2 darn good teams. Does that make it like, well, Ohio State was excellent, and man, that was a great win over Texas in the quarters, and they really took it to Georgia in the semis, but then when they played Oregon that 3rd time in the national championship game, they came up a field goal short. Does it make it a little less natty or bust when the road requires 3 big time wins, or no? Like, is there no excuse land when it comes to natty or bust?
I think that being a true natty or bust team is going to become harder. Like, I don't know that we're going to have as many when winning a national championship will be so hard. This is a dynamic that I'm fascinated to see, because if you are Ohio State or Georgia or Alabama or one of these teams, it's like you could be a top 3 team in the country, maybe even the best team in the country, but you still have to beat 3 or 4 top 8 teams in a row just to get to that point. So I think that just the expectation of winning the way that maybe we saw Nick Saban do, even that we've seen Kirby Smart do at Georgia the past couple of years, I think that in general, that's going to start to diminish a little bit. I don't think that people will have such natty or bust expectations. I think Ohio State in any system would have still been in this situation just because of their unique confluence of events. But I do think that what might replace it a little bit is not necessarily a natty or bust type mindset, but more of a playoff or bust type mindset, where if you, and potentially even, well, you can't just make the playoff. You got to win a game, man. Like, you got to make the Final Four. Come on, you got to win 1 or 2 games in this thing. I look at a situation like Lane Kiffin or James Franklin, where you have legitimate roadblocks in your own conference with Ohio State and Michigan, with Alabama and Georgia for Ole Miss. So there was never a realistic path for you to actually make the playoff with much consistency. Well, now all of a sudden, there is that path. You should expect to be in it almost every single year. And on top of that, when you don't have to go through the top 2 or 3 teams in the country, you better start winning some games. I mean, I look at James Franklin. This was actually one of the topics that we discussed today on the College Football Survivor show. It is like, well, if you are James Franklin and you finish as the 6th seed and you lose to the 11, that hits in a very different type of way than just missing the playoff. Like, I think that that's a much more dangerous situation for a head coach. So I think that there will be fewer legitimate natty or bust type teams in the 12-team playoff. But at the same time, I think that different coaches at different levels are going to feel levels of pressure in a unique kind of way.
Do you believe that our sport will be able to adapt to different thresholds of success? Because I do think college basketball has it right that you count Sweet 16s. Hey, the Sweet 16, like that's a level of success. You count Final Fours. You don't only count national championships. When we talk about the best teams in college basketball or the all-time legendary coaches, you don't only say how many titles did they win, because there are other very easy ways. Now, you don't really say how many conference titles did they win. That's not just what we say. It's still based on the postseason. But I am hopeful and looking forward to the idea of, hey, that coach, hey, he made the playoff 4 times in 6 years. Or, hey, that coach, I would like to adopt the Final Four vernacular for college football. I don't know why we wouldn't. Or a Final Eight, or the Elite Eight, or whatever we want to call it. And I do think that will, to your point about James Franklin, it could increase pressure, but it also could establish something concrete that is a step or two short of you've got to win it all. So now you only have one happy team. I hope we can do that. Can we? Can the sport do it?
I think we can. Now, look, for the elite of the elite, I think it's largely still going to be national championships, right? I think that Ohio State, for Georgia, we'll see what Alabama is in this new era. I think that it's still going to be a lot about national championships, but especially for, let's say that the top 6 are in that group. For teams 7 through 18, I think that winning playoff games is going to be huge. I think making playoffs is going to be huge. I think that that pulling upsets is going to be huge. And I absolutely think that we're going to be in a world where all of a sudden more coaches have the opportunity of national success. One coach that I talked about on our show earlier today is John Sumrall over at Tulane, right? Like, if he becomes the first coach to pull the 12-5 upset, then he becomes an SEC coach the very next year. It's just going to happen, right? You look at this past cycle, he was in conversations with a couple of major programs, but I think that this is an opportunity to draw far more attention to your coach. I look at Boise State in the 2000s. They were able to build themselves to a level where we had to talk about them because they were a top 5 level team. And I think that they have every aspiration of trying to become that in this expanded college football playoff era. So I absolutely think that college football will try to adjust. And I mean, just even from our perspective, like, I've seen changes in the way that we are covering the sport on a national level because we know these types of teams. There's going to be an ACC team. There's going to be a Group of 5 team. There's going to be a Big 12 team. And so it means that you have to kind of open the sport in a different kind of way and find success in different places.
I love it. Isn't it going to be awesome? Are you fired up? 12.
I can't wait. Let's just go ahead and not do the 4 auto bid thing heading forward, and I'll be good.
Real quick, do you believe in Kalen DeBoer at Alabama, or do you have questions about the fit?
So it'll be interesting for sure. I don't want to dismiss that, but I do think ultimately, I mean, Kalen DeBoer has won everywhere. He is a fantastic football coach. He just figures things out in so many ways. And I think that ultimately, when you put somebody in that kind of position and have that level of consistency at different levels, his player acquisition in its own way has been great. He's built teams that are that level, and he's done it at the FBS and now at the power conference level. I think that it's going to be a fit. And I actually think in an NIL era where it maybe becomes more about, like, it's more of a general manager type situation than just being an on the ground gumshoe recruiter. I think that potentially that could be a really smart move that will pay off in a big way.
I have questions. I'm not sure. I have a little bit of like Rich Rod at Michigan vibes with that. So I'm not. I
think that Kalen DeBoer, personality wise, is definitely a different kind of guy than Rich Rod from everybody that I talked to.
Well, you got to hate on Rich Rod. What are you doing, man?
I mean, there's some reasons.
Offensive innovator.
Yeah. What happened to Arizona now? I don't know.
He's Shehan Jeyarajah. He's a swell fella. The people can find your writing at cbssports.com. Your finger's still working. You're still cranking stuff out.
Still doing the thing.
And then, of course, you can listen to the College Football Survivor Show wherever you find podcasts. Shahan, great to see you, man. That'll do it for this edition of the Kings of the North college football thing that we do here. Thanks, as always, to our great producer, Mike Yerstowski, for making us look good and sound good. He's Shahan. I'm Doug. And that was Kings of the North.